Welcome to RH at Home. I'm Chad Clement, pastor here at Redemption Hill Church, and we're glad that you're joining us as we continue walking through the book of Matthew. Last week, and really actually the last couple of weeks, we settled in Matthew chapter 13, where we saw Jesus take a new approach to his teaching. He taught in parables, several parables that we try to kind of deconstruct and look at and dig and find the spiritual truth that Jesus intended for his audience then, that we can use and apply in our lives today. Chapter 14 is another very interesting chapter. And we're gonna spend some time in this chapter as we've done in the previous chapters. Today we're gonna look at the first 13 verses, and we're gonna see this story. It's interesting in the fact that it starts here, and then we almost have like a flat, like Matthew kind of takes a pause in his narrative, and then we have to go a flashback in time, and then bring us back into its current state. And so we're going to talk about Jesus at the end. There's going to be reference to him, but really one of the prominent characters in the New Testament, but really a man that's not written much about. A man we've seen already in our studies, a man that was kind of viewed as somewhat peculiar by his wardrobe and the things that he said, the things that he ate. So we're going to pick up in Matthew chapter 14, starting in verse 1. And it says, "At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, 'This is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him.'" So in these first two verses, what we're introduced to this situation, this scene. First, we meet this Herod. There are a few Herods mentioned in Scripture. I believe there's 4. So let me just take like a moment to just kind of make sure we know who we're talking about. The first Herod that we're introduced to is during the Christmas story. If you recall, Jesus is born in a manger, and there's Herod the Great who is on this hunt to find Jesus. You recall the wise men come through and they have a meeting with Herod, and they're following the stars and they're coming to find the new king, and Herod wants to find this child and ultimately have this child killed. Well, that's Herod the Great. Herod the Great, earned the name not because he was a great ruler, but because he was a great builder. He had constructed some enormous, mammoth buildings and structures. But Herod was also known as a very wicked man, a man that had been married probably at bare minimum 10 times. A man who was bloodthirsty, and that bloodthirst wasn't absent from his own family. Like he had some of his wives killed. He had some of his own children killed out of threats or potential threats or rumors of threats towards his power. So Herod the Great was a wicked, evil man, ruler. Well, some of his sons, the ones that were fortunate not to have been killed in his lust for power. Well, one of the sons we see here, he's called in this passage here in verse 1, Herod the Tetrarch. Well, he's better known as Herod Antipas. Now, there's just for us to kind of get this situation clear. 3 of those sons that Herod had are in power. Antipas didn't rule all of Israel, and remember, these are Roman rulers, and so Herod Antipas is going to rule it's going to rule kind of like the Sea of Galilee or the Galilean area. So if we realize that much of Jesus' ministry has taken place in his territory. We've talked about this as we've walked through the book of Matthew. Jesus came from Nazareth, a no place, no town, a hick town, like an insignificant place. And he came from by the world standards, an insignificant family. And so Jesus was really a nobody until he began to gain some following and gain some, for lack of better words, fame for his powerful preaching, powerful teaching, along with these miraculous works. And so Jesus had been gaining this attention. The crowds were getting bigger and bigger. And as a result of that, he came on the radar of Herod Antipas. And what we see is this scene now. Herod Antipas is thinking that this is John the Baptist. And for those of us, as we've walked through this book of Matthew, there's an alarming statement here. It says in verse 2, he said to his servants, Antipas says to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead." If you recall, we were introduced to John the Baptist early in the book of Matthew. He was the one who baptized Jesus. Later we realized, and as we went through as we've gone through our study, that John the Baptist was arrested. Go back to chapter 11, we see John the Baptist again through his disciples. John the Baptist sends his followers or some of his disciples to go find Jesus with this really important question. A question of critical importance. He basically sent them and said, "Are you really the Messiah?" Maybe you remember that study back in Matthew chapter 11. That's the last time we see John the Baptist. So when Jesus answers the questions to those disciples of John the Baptist, they return to John the Baptist with the good news that he was the Messiah. But we're left with John the Baptist in prison. Now we get into chapter 14, and Jesus has caught the ear. He's on the radar of Herod Antipas, and Herod Antipas looks and he sees this powerful preaching. He's heard these rumors of these miraculous works. And what he begins to think is John the Baptist has been raised from the dead. And so what we're going to see here is Matthew, in this pause in his narrative, is going to go back in time and explain what had happened to John the Baptist there in prison. And we're going to see a picture here. And one of the things that I appreciate in Scripture is that we see the good, but oftentimes we see the bad and we see the gnarly. The Lord doesn't sugarcoat like sin and its effects. In fact, today as we look at this story, we're gonna see something that rivals bad soap operas. We're gonna see dysfunction at an extreme level. And so going back to the scripture, Matthew chapter 14, we'll pick up in verse 3. It says, "For Herod had seized John and bound him and put him into prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had been saying to him, 'It is not lawful for you to have her.' And though he wanted to put him to death, he feared the people because they held him to be a prophet." And so what we see is the reason, it's explained, Matthew explains to us why John the Baptist had been arrested, why he'd been put in jail, in prison. The situation, we talked about this several weeks back in our study, but we, again, as I began to tell us before, we have Herod the Great, who had a few sons. A few of the sons in this triangle that we see taking place is we see Aristobulus, who had a daughter named Herodias. Okay, so Herod the Great, Aristobulus, one son, Antipas, another son, Philip, a third son. Okay, in this triangle here, Aristobulus' daughter was Herodias. Herodias marries Philip, like her uncle, which is already weird, right? So niece marrying Uncle Philip, not a good thing. Well, then in the middle we have Antipas. And Antipas, who had been married to another lady, divorces her, gets rid of her, kind of shuns her, and then convinces Herodias to come and be with him. So again, remember, like, think this like dysfunctional, like really sinful type family. We have Herod the Great, already said, over 10 wives, bloodthirsty, lustful, all these bad things, and that temperament, that sin, that moral code was passed down to his children. And so then we have a niece marrying one uncle, then leaving him and going and marrying another uncle. And so John the Baptist sees this, sees the sin and how bad it is, and he's calling them out. I mean, John the Baptist is literally saying, like, it's not lawful, it's not right, this is wrong. And it upsets Antipas and specifically Herodias. And we see here that Herod ultimately has John the Baptist arrested. It's interesting because we can read about the same story in the book of Mark chapter 6. And see, what happens is when we look at Matthew and we look at Mark, it fleshes out the story a little bit further. We see that Herod finds himself, for lack of better words, in a pickle. He wants John the Baptist dead, but he realizes that John the Baptist had a large following. Many people were followers of him, many disciples, and he was viewed throughout Galilee as a prophet. And so he was held in high esteem. And so if Herod had killed him, had him killed, executed, there would have been a great uproar amongst the people. So there was that. But then there was also, when we see in Mark, I think it's 6:19, that Herod acknowledges that John the Baptist was a righteous man. He was a holy man. He was a good man. And so he really didn't deserve the punishment that Herod, and more specifically Herodias, wanted to bestow upon him. And so Herod wants to, but realizes that it would not bode well for him to have him executed. But then you have Herodias, his wife, who is absolutely focused on having him killed, executed, murdered. And so what we see is, again, specifically in Mark chapter 6, verse 20, that Herod decides to put John the Baptist in prison for John's safety. Right? And the idea kind of, I think, from Herod's standpoint is, we can put him in prison and he can just live the rest of his life in prison. Kind of shunned away from everybody. We won't see him, we won't hear him, out of sight, out of mind. And it was maybe good for Herod, but was not good enough for Herodias. Picking up in verse 6, it says, "But when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced before the company and pleased Herod, so that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. Prompted by her mother, she said, 'Give me the head of John the Baptist here on a platter.' And the king was sorry, but because of his oath and his guest, he commanded it to be given. Verse 10, he sent and had John beheaded in the prison, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. And his disciples came and took the body and buried it. And they went and told Jesus." Verse 13, we'll just kind of end this and talk through it. It says, "When Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself." You see this picture, this story, this grudge that Herodias had been carrying for a while began to fester and continue to fester. It literally ate away at her soul. She was so determined, so focused to get even or to just like as we said before, have John the Baptist killed. That she waited for the right time, and this time appeared when Herod was having a birthday party for himself. And he invites all the bigwigs in Galilee, the military leaders, the government leaders, the people of influence, the who's who of Galilee, all came to this party. It was a big party. And again, understand this. Herod, wicked, evil man. I mean, a debauchery. We've already talked about, like, so you can picture the scene. The wine is flowing, laughter, and all sorts of things taking place. And Herodias decides to capitalize on this moment. So she goes to her daughter, Salome. It was not Antipas's daughter. It was the daughter of Philip. Yet it was still his stepdaughter. And it says girl there. Don't picture like a little, like, elementary age girl. Like, she's at the very least she's a teenager. Christian history tells us that her name was Salome. Salome goes and through her mom's nudge, she goes and she dances before the crowd, the audience, the guests there. Now again, we're not talking Dancing with the Stars. She's not doing the polka or ballet or whatever. This was suggestive dancing. This is erotic dancing. This is the intent of producing lustful desires from the audience, those that were there. You know, as we said, the twisting and the dysfunction and the sin that has gripped this family. We have Herod there with a wife that he's taken from his brother, who is really his niece. And then she has her daughter, Herod's stepdaughter, come, who is the princess, if you will. Probably dressed with next to nothing.